to our Physiology 101 series. Today we're going to be talking about a little bit of neuroanatomy. And I know neuroanatomy is a pretty complex topic, so today we're going to be keeping it pretty simple, just talking about some of the basic components of our nervous system and how they work. All right, so our nervous system itself is comprised of like a central and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. So with the brain, we have the thing we're really talking about for the most part that we're going to concern ourselves with today is the cortex. The cortex is really where basically all of our consciousness is taking place. So that's where we're like making connections, processing information, and sending it back down for motor responses and stuff like that. So for as far as our cortex goes, here we kind of have like a little diagram of our brain. Our brain's broken up into four lobes. So we have our frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, right? So the frontal lobe, that's like the thing, it's most developed in humans, and that's really the part of the brain that makes us most human. So that's where information that is going to be exchanged and processed that's regarding judgment, mood, foresight, planning, and then most importantly, motor control. And that's, like I said, it's much higher level processing. So this is what allows us to think and come up with inventions and stuff like that. Like this is what makes us really human. All right, and so next we're going to talk about the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe, that's more where a lot of our sensory information gets processed in the brain, and also proprioception, so like where our bodies are in space. But this is where what we feel with the outside world, like touch and stuff like that, is coming up to the brain, and that's where our perception of things like that is processed, right? Next, we're going to talk about the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is more regards to memory, hearing, language. So that's really where we develop those kinds of skills, and that's where those information regarding those skills is processed. And then lastly, the occipital lobe, that is pretty solely concerning vision. And we'll kind of talk about that down the line. Today we're not going to be as concerned with the occipital lobe, right? So kind of referring over to here, one of the things that we talk about a lot in our videos is movement, and then even like perception, and so feeling the outside world, so motor and sensory components of the brain. So the motor, these little diagrams here are actually showing you what's called the homunculus, and it's a basically somatotopic representation of where on our brain these different parts of our body are kind of like located topically as a map, right? So these diagrams here are basically if we took the brain, this is like longitudinal, and we just turned it towards you and took a cross section of it, right? And so this motor homunculus is referring to if we took like a cross section of the brain, like right here at the back of the frontal lobe, all right? And so what this is showing you is that as it infolds on the medial side of the brain, that's where these cell bodies here are basically processing and sending out information in regards to motor control and voluntary movement of our feet, moving up a little bit more superior. You get to the ankle, lower leg, knee, then up over the top we start getting into the hip, torso, and then arm right here. And then as we come down the lateral side of the the frontal lobe, you get more into the face, eyeballs, nose, mouth, jaw, and then down here more so tongue, right? And so that's just, like I said, a topical representation of, it's kind of crazy how there's different spots in the brain you can pinpoint what these cells are basically interpreting and sending out information for. And so on the other side, the sensory homunculus, what we're going to find is it's right around here. So right behind the motor homunculus is the sensory homunculus. Same thing, cross section of the brain right through this area right here. And it's very similar, slightly different, but so on the medial side over the top, you're gonna have foot, ankle sensation, going up, getting into the knee, hip. Right here is like the head. So over here we had kind of like the face down here. You don't really have motor movements of your head. So head is sensory, is gonna be up here, moving down. You notice the thumb is big. So the size of things also kind of represents how sensitive and like how important those things are to that sensation and that processing. So you can see our faces are really big. Sensory, we have a lot of sensory adaptation in our face, lips, teeth, tongue, and then down here we have gastrointestinal. So slightly different, but also similar kind of in layout as they go, right? And then just more emphasis on one side or the other of what is processed in that area, right? So we're not really going to get into temporal or occipital, kind of like I said. We'll maybe talk about those in future videos, but for today we're going to kind of stick with like the motor and sensory processing in the cortex, right? So moving down, also part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. And so the spinal cord is really where it's like a highway basically for our bodies of either motor or sensory information, and whether it's going up or down towards the brain or out to the periphery. But basically, for the most part, generally, sensory is coming up the spinal cord and motor is going down, right? And so right here, we have a little diagram of a cross-section of the spinal cord, right? So if you just cut right through the spinal cord, like right there, right? And so what you see here is there's kind of two different tissues that we're gonna see in here. You're gonna have white matter and we call it gray matter in the middle, like this little thing here. And so the white matter is basically current highways taking place, right? So that's axons of nerves, right? So the long axons of nerves traveling up the spinal cord, which will eventually synapse in here or down to a level where in the gray matter is where the cells will synapse or connect to other cells, okay? And so for the most part, we're gonna have the dorsal side of the gray matter, so these are called the dorsal horns. That's where sensory information from the periphery is going to come in and synapse in the spinal cord, and then from there either connect to some other nerves or shoot up to the brain to tell the brain what's going on. And then the ventral side or the front of the spinal cord is where a lot of the motor neurons are going to synapse and where those cell bodies are going to be at, which same thing, they're either gonna send information out to the periphery or continue down, either synapse somewhere else and continue down, or wherever the track may be, right? And so basically the big importance for the spinal cord is that it's, like I said, it's the highway for everything traveling through the body. And so it's really important that these tracks are getting to where they need to be, and there's so many connections that are made in the spinal cord as well as the brain, right? So that's kind of like, and then we'll get to the cerebellum, but for the most part, that's the central nervous system, what we consider that. And then as we move on, we're going to talk more about the peripheral nervous system, right? And so the peripheral nervous system is basically what we think of as nerves, right? So as these nerves exit the spinal cord, we now get into the periphery. And the peripheral nervous system is basically made up of two different components. You have your somatic nervous system, which is going to talk about basically stuff going to skeletal muscle and stuff like that. And then we have our autonomic nervous system, which is going to be gastrointestinal things that basically aren't voluntary movements, but still muscles that are going to be, nerves going to muscles that are going to be doing things just without you even knowing it, right? And then we have like the sensory component of our peripheral nervous system, which is everything from the outside world traveling on nerves towards, basically in the direction towards the spinal cord, right? And so we've kind of touched on this as we go, but this is a good place to introduce the concept of afferent and efferent like pathways, right? And so efferent pathways are going to be traveling out towards towards away from it, and afferent pathways are going to be traveling in towards the central nervous system, right? And so the diagram here is basically showing two different pathways, right? So this is like a little diagram of a sensory organ, and then this right here is a diagram of a muscle, right? And so what's going on in the peripheral nervous system is basically our connection to the outside world. And so the motor signals that are coming down, once they exit the spinal cord, they're traveling on peripheral nerves out to skeletal muscle, and those are gonna ultimately lead to locomotion for our bodies, how we move and stuff. And then on the other hand, sensory information is gonna travel into the body via these sensory peripheral nerves. And going back to looking at the spinal cord, you can see, so once they exit the spinal cord, you'll have motor nerves and sensory nerves basically coming together to form the spinal nerve, and from there they'll split and travel with each other. But after the spinal nerve, closer to the CNS, is where they kind of split, and that's where the sensory information travels to the back of the spinal cord, and the motor information is traveling out the front of the spinal cord, right? So these are kind of going in two different directions, with blue heading in and red heading out, okay? So that's kind of a good rundown of the peripheral nervous system. And then to kind of sum it all up, we have our cerebellum, which is kind of like just like a mini brain under our brain. And really what this is doing is fine-tuning all the connections that are going on through here. The cerebellum's kind of hooked up to all of it, and it's gonna basically be checking everything and making sure, like, oh, is that right? Is his arm moving too far? Is his foot moving too fast, right? So it's fine-tuning everything and causing corrections. And that's why, for like kind of a little insight into how the cerebellum works, when you drink alcohol and it inhibits cells in the cerebellum, that's why you stagger all around when you're walking, is because your cerebellum's inhibited. And so now you can't fine-tune all your movements. And so what you're intending to do isn't always exactly what you're doing, right? So a lot of information here. It's very complex, our nervous systems. Today was just really scratching the surface, but we're gonna get into a little bit further as we go. But if you like the video, go ahead and like, subscribe, check out some of our other videos, and we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks.